All right, Mike, let's look back on the first fight between Canelo Alvarez and Gennady Golovkin. That was back in 2017, the mega fight involving the two top middleweights in the world. How did you score that fight?
I scored the first fight 115, 113, 7 rounds to five in favor of Canelo. And I know there was a lot of argument about it. I actually felt, Chris, that a lot of the arguments about the scorecards, and in particular, one of the official scorecards, Adelaide Bird's 118 to 110, took a lot away from the contest. And what we should have been remembering was a very special contest at a time when I think the sport needed it. It was just a few weeks after Floyd Mayweather had fought Conor McGregor, and the sport had taken so much stick globally for that, even though it created a tremendous amount of interest, generally speaking. The boxing purists were looking at this fight between Canelo and Golovkin first time around as almost a fight that was there to save boxing. And I think that what we read so much about and heard so much about afterwards around the scorecards diluted the special nature of what a contest it was. And I remember saying at the time on BBC Radio how, in terms of the skill, the power, the determination, the resilience, the pedigree, the experience, all of the different factors, there probably wasn't a fight anywhere in boxing at that stage could have been made to match it. And yet all we seem to talk about, and up to today, as we look ahead to the third fight, is the scorecards. I found it actually a very difficult fight to score. Looking at the judges' scorecards, the first 2 rounds were given to Canelo by all of the judges. The last 3 rounds were given to Canelo by all of the judges. So clearly, officially, the fight was settled in those middle rounds. And it was fascinating to me how both fighters enjoyed spells on top and at times refused to let the other back in. But so strong were they both, so full of great pedigree, that they worked their way back in to the fight. And I think it was a really special occasion to remember. And as I say, for me, diluted by the row around the scoring.
Well, Mike, let me say to you something that's been said to me many times over the last 5 years. Your scorecard's just wrong. Because that to me was not a particularly difficult fight to score. I thought Canelo was successful in the first third of the fight. He had his moments. But from there on out, I thought it was all Gennady Golovkin. I thought Golovkin controlled the fight with a jab that was a power punch. Golovkin throws a power jab, and he was landing that liberally on Canelo throughout that fight. Canelo also looked like a fighter that ran out of gas for most of the second half of the fight. If you remember, he started off a little bit more aggressive with some movement, but in the latter stage, especially those middle rounds, he was fighting off the ropes a lot. He was fighting off his back foot. He was allowing Golovkin to dictate the pace of that fight. And I thought Golovkin was able to capitalize on it. I don't think it was a blowout by any stretch, but I'm with you. The focus on Adelaide Bird's scorecard, and there was the third scorecard, the one that scored it a draw, where there was one round in there. I believe it was the seventh round that seemed like a clear round for Golovkin that was scored for Canelo. If it had flipped the other way, it would have been a decision win for Gennady Golovkin. I just thought he did more than enough to win that fight. That's why in the second fight, Canelo came in with what looked like a completely different strategy.
And here's where I think you're wrong, Chris, and those of you who feel the same way. Fights like this cannot only be scored by the number of punches landed. If that was the case, all we would need, all of us, is CompuBox. We could turn away, have a cigarette, have a coffee, and then turn back, and we just look at how many punches have been landed. What I thought was brilliant about Canelo in some of those rounds, and I'll accept he seemed to lose the initiative. And you could argue it was him being relatively inactive. You could argue it was Golovkin imposing himself on the fight. And I could be persuaded that it was Golovkin who turned it his way in those middle rounds. But some of the defensive work of Canelo Alvarez, which is really, really important in setting up a victory. It demoralizes the opponent if they keep missing. It demoralizes an opponent when they do strike, and the opponent takes it as well as Canelo did. Now, I know that doesn't factor into the scoring, but his ring generalship, his work in defense in making Golovkin miss, and therefore making Golovkin really have to think about how he was setting up his moves, was a very important factor in the fight. Too often in the scoring of boxing, that isn't taken into account. And I'm not going back to the days of Willie Pep and saying, oh, it's not like it was in the 50s and that Canelo belonged in a different age. I'm not going there at all. I'm just saying that we cannot judge a contest of such marvels in terms of skill only on the number of punches that landed. You cannot ignore what Canelo did in terms of defense. I will listen to the argument that he was pushed onto the back foot and therefore had to react like that. But he did, and set up openings for some counter punches, and did finish the fight strongly as well. So, that's where I think that you and others who felt Golovkin was badly robbed on the night. I mean, take away that one scorecard, and I reiterate, I actually think it was a difficult fight to score.
Yeah, I had it 116, 112 for Golovkin. Felt pretty comfortable with that scorecard at the time. And look, I get it. Canelo's ring generalship is a part of what makes him a special fighter. I just didn't see it as much in that fight as I've seen it in previous fights and in subsequent fights. I thought Golovkin was able to get close to him. And even though he wasn't connecting clean on everything, and Canelo was countering pretty well, fighting off those ropes, I thought it was 2-3 punches for every one good shot that Canelo landed. And I think that was enough for Gennady Golovkin to get the win in that first fight.
I'll tell you something that also struck me watching it back as well, Chris, having seen it live, but watching it back, the referee, Kenny Bayliss, was virtually unemployed. And that's a great credit to both of those fighters. However you scored it, they just wanted to get on with it. Two true, honest, hard men who just wanted to get on with it. And then it struck me as I was watching it back, and have done a few times in the last few weeks since the announcement that the trilogy had been confirmed, that actually, this was a fight that almost could have happened without a referee.